Bonjour. This is the Filmlings Podcast World Tour,
a special summer series where we explore filmmaking from around the world.
Je suis Jonathan.
Et je suis Alex.
Et c'est la semaine 25, France Fraiche.
Right, and this is a follow-up to last week, a really great follow-up to last week, another part in our series. We're talking about the French New Wave this week. That's why the title of this episode is Fraiche, France, but, you know, in French. And it was selected by you, our listeners, and we really appreciate that you picked such a good follow-up to Italian Neorealism.
Yeah, this is going to be quite the episode. The French New Wave is like one of the, if not the most influential periods in cinema history. It pulled in a lot of influences, but the influences that came out of it were just completely astounding. So many films, almost all the films that you've seen have been influenced by the French New Wave in some way or another. And it could probably deserve its own podcast in itself, and there might be one out there, but we're gonna try and take 3 films and try and boil the French New Wave down to its essentials and give an overview of what it was trying to do and what it actually accomplished.
Right. This week we're going to be the French New Wavelings.
Right.
So a brief history on what the French New Wave is and how it came about. Following the end of World War II, 1946, after the end of the German occupation of France, a bunch of American movies and a bunch of American cultural products start flooding into France. And a lot of the young people at the time gobble these up. They're really into it. And one of the publications that there's a lot of movie magazines that start up in France at this time, but one of the movie magazines that start up is called Cahiers du Cinéma. And this is where all of the directors of the right bank of the French New Wave, the right bank is the super monetarily successful, the super poppy. These are the people who make the films that you really think of when you think of the French New Wave. This is where they all meet. They are all writers for Cahiers du Cinéma. And they get together, talk about movies, become obsessed with movies, and eventually they go on to make their own films. And this is François Truffaut, Jean-Luc Godard, Claude Charbot, Eric Rohmer, and Jacques Rivette. Those are kind of the big 5. They called themselves the Young Turks at the time, as lots of young people groups like to call themselves. And they kind of pioneered the French New Wave. They kind of started it, and then they were followed later on by some older directors, and by older I mean not early 20s, so like around 30. They're not like super old, but older, more literary minded directors, and this was called the left bank of the French New Wave. So there you have Agnes Varda, Henri Coppi, Jacques Demy, Chris Marker, and Alain Resnais. Just a few of the left bank group, and they are not as well known as the right bank, but they still make really good films. Agnes Varda was super prolific, and she's still making films, I believe. And of course, Alain Resnais made Hiroshima Mon Amour, which is one of the most famous films of the French New Wave.
Yeah, and the left bank kind of saw the right bank as a little bit more commercial. Like once they kind of got their style, they kind of got into this place where the film started to feel very similar to each other. And so the left bank took influences from the right bank. They're still in the same movement, but they were a little bit more experimental, a little bit more out of the box even than the right bank was. And so I think there's probably even influences from the Surrealists, because the Surrealists were, located in Paris. So their influences already felt through France from the 30s. And so all of that gets brought into different kinds of narrative filmmaking in the left bank, but all throughout the French New Wave.
Right. And don't think that they hated each other either. They weren't rivals, and they didn't disparage each other. They were actually quite friendly. But they were consciously in kind of different zones, different frames of mind for the French New Wave in terms of creative aesthetic. between the right bank and the left bank.
Yeah, and I mean, even they collaborated together across banks, and especially within their own bank, so to speak, there were a lot of collaborating on writing and guest cameoing in each other's films and stuff like that. So it was pretty tight knit, and all the stuff that came out of it was pretty much pure gold.
Right. And the real question, besides how many times we can say bank in this episode, is what was the big effect of the French New Wave? And that is what we're going to be talking about today in detail. But before we get into it in detail, we just wanted to list a few of the things that we're going to be talking about, such as changes in editing, camera stylo, or the camera as a pen.
And then from camera stylo comes auteur theory. Auteur theory starts in the French New Wave. Also conventions like breaking the fourth wall, which aren't exclusive but used a lot in this movement, and the different ways of moving the camera to tell the story.
Right. And these, like Jonathan said before, these will all sound really familiar as things you see in modern movies, especially if you're a fan of my favorite, Wes Anderson. I just got slipping back in there, Jonathan. I'm sorry.
Also, I mean, we're going back to Shane Carruth, Christopher Nolan. Like, we're going to be referencing ourselves a lot this week, probably.
Right. I mean, that's the world tour is all going to be about referencing each other. But that's the fun of it, seeing how global cinema is interacting with itself across both space and time, and how it makes really awesome movies. So let's talk about what movies we're going to talk about today before we actually talk about those movies, because that's just how we do.
Right. So to kick it off, we're starting with The 400 Blows by Francois Truffaut.
Truffaut had, at his time during Cahiers du Cinéma, thrown some shade at the old style of filmmaking that was really popular at the Cannes Film Festival and by the big studios in France at the time. And it had done it so hard that he had gotten himself banned from Cannes. And then he turned around in 1959, the next year after he'd gotten banned, and made The 400 Blows. It went to the Cannes Film Festival, and Truffaut won the Best Director award that year.
Yep, that's back to the old surrealist dilemma of rebelling and becoming accepted anyway.
And I also want to point out, because this is something I just found out, and I'm really excited to watch the next 4 movies in the series when I get the time. But the main character in this film, Antoine Donnel, is actually the subject of 4 other movies by Francois Truffaut that kind of form a series that cover his time from a young teenager in The 400 Blows to his early 30s in his 5th and final movie.
Yeah, and I think this film definitely stands apart. I don't think it was intended to have any more films, but probably after the popularity and the fact that the child actor was so good, kind of naturally spawned some more material after that Truffaut could explore some other themes in.
Right. And Jean Laud, the guy who plays Antoine Donnel, is actually still acting. He's still around. He just did a film called The Death of Louis the 14th, the one before the one who got his head chopped off. But it looks really good. It looks really French. But he's still around, so he's been very prolific. So unlike the actors in Italian Neorealism who were not professionals and kind of faded after they were in Italian Neorealistic films, the actors in French New Wave, in these French New Wave films, kind of stuck around. They saw their star rise with the movement, and a lot of them stuck around and have very productive careers within the industry.
Our second film is Breathless from 1960 by Jean-Luc Godard, who is one of the most famous of the French New Wave directors. He's practically a household name. Whenever there's a scene that's edited really weird, you think, oh man, it's like a Godard film. So it's credited as being written by Truffaut and Charbot, but it's kind of a little bit more the fact that Truffaut had already established himself with the 400 blows and used his fame already to help get Breathless made. But once that hit, it kind of caused an explosion, and Godard didn't really need anyone else's backing after that.
Right. And Truffaut and Charbot came up with the original treatment after they saw an article kind of mirroring the events that you see in Breathless. But they didn't do much after that. They just signed on for a writer's credit and like associate producer's credit, and then didn't do much else with the film. Right.
And our final film is Cleo from 5 to 7 from 1962 by Agnes Varda, our little step into the left bank. And it actually has a cameo by Jean-Luc Godard.
Right. So when you're talking about collaboration between the two and how they are friendly and they do like each other, here's some proof. Here's Godard in a Varda film.
Right. So do we want to jump into it?
So, The 400 Blows from 1959 by Francois Truffaut. Amazing film, his first film, and I could only hope that my first film would be that amazing. And it is kind of semi-autobiographical. It follows a troubled youth, a young teenager. He's probably 13, 14 years old, named Antoine Donnel. We talked about how he has his own little series going on. Or that went on, that was created by Francois Truffaut. But it follows his struggles through what you might call the petit bourgeois in France in the post-World War II era, around 1959. And his struggles with school and a mother who kind of doesn't want him, and a stepfather who kind of just tolerates him, and him just not fitting into society the way that society would want him to fit in at that age, and his acting out and his repeated running away from both his problems and his home.
Yeah, and like you said, it's something of an autobiographical film, and that's one of the things that we'll talk about with the French New Wave, is that this was definitely a way for directors to express their own life experience and their own worldview through film. As opposed to some of the studio films that were being made in France at the time, which were basically just taking, established classic literature and creating cookie cutter productions of them. These were very personal, very intimate films. And Truffaut had a very similarly troubled childhood with parents who gave him up at a very young age, and he kind of bounced around a little bit and got into some minor crime stuff, and his stepdad turned him over to the police. And so it's a lot of that coming back, and this is a little bit of an outlet for him to put all that on screen.
Right. And it has, so when you look at how kind of I guess the right word might be gritty, realistic, definitely dramatic, and definitely I guess pessimistic in its outlook. It almost feels like a neorealist film in that way.
Right. It reminded me a lot of Bicycle Thieves in the tone and some of the subject matter as well. Just like this characters who have been oppressed from all sides by things that feel like they're out of his control, and then that eventually breaking his, in this case, kind of molding him to have a little bit of a warped sense of what is right and wrong.
Yeah, and the story of how and why they cast Jean-Pierre Laude as Antoine Donnel, the one-to-one semi-autobiographical figure who represented Francois Truffaut as a young kid, has a lot to do with Jean-Pierre Laude essentially having a very similar childhood to both Truffaut and the character Donnel. He actually improvises a lot of his, or some of his dialogue within the film, including the famous interrogation scene, or I guess not interrogation scene, the analysis scene with the therapist towards the end of the film. A lot of that is improvised on set by Jean-Pierre Laude, and him and Truffaut had a really good working relationship together.
Hence,
And
4 more films afterwards.
yeah, hence 4 more films afterwards, obviously. But they saw eye to eye really well, and they had very similar childhoods. And I think that you definitely sense that when watching the film. You sense that coming through. Just stepping back from like the French New Wave aspect of it all for a second, and looking at it as a film that's really good in and of itself, set aside from the movement. That's a really interesting fact, and it's definitely a factor as to why it's so good. Is that the main character, the lead actor, and the director were all so similar.
Yeah, and that's also another kind of tie that we can bring to Italian Neorealism, in the fact that these are not like highly trained professional actors a lot of the times, and that kind of rough around the edges rawness of the performances is a huge draw of these films. We'll see that again in Breathless. It's just the fact that the characters or the actors can also internalize their performances and bring that out is a huge part of what captivates people about these movies.
Yeah, and then, of course, taking it back to the French New Wave, the topic of today's episode, there's a lot of very stylistic choices in the 400 Blows. Not, I would say, not as obvious as in Breathless or Cleo from 5 to 7. Certainly not as bold as in Breathless, but definitely there, and definitely a break from the what the French New Wave called the cinema du papa, or your grandpa's movies. But you see a lot of really quick camera movements, a lot of quick pans. There's this really, really cool, really fun top-down pan scene with this kind of poppy music in the background as a PE class is running through the streets and all the kids slowly desert. It's really funny.
It's just a fun scene.
Right.
Comic relief in the middle of otherwise kind of sad material.
Yeah, very true. And each of the directors that in the French New Wave and that we're talking about today kind of developed their own camera style, their own camera signatures, their own things that they like to do. And this is the first of Truffaut's films. This is the first one where he's he's transitioning from essentially like a film enthusiast and film critic to a film director. And he's still experimenting with the medium, and he's still getting his feet wet. Think of it as like Wes Anderson's Bottle Rocket. Like the style isn't fully developed, but it's still a really good film. And that's how I feel about the 400 Blows. When you look at its style, because it's got that Truffaut style, but it isn't as bold or strong as in Breathless, which is a Godard film, not a Truffaut film, or even to compare it to another thing by Truffaut as like Jules and Jim is, which has just a ton of pans and a ton of still frames in it.
Yeah, and still frame is the other thing that shows up in the 400 Blows. Is the very last thing that we see is a freeze frame of our main character. And this, I don't know if it's the first time this was ever done, but it is not like, a lot of, like we've seen so many times the ending on a freeze frame, like Rocky or The Karate Kid, I think too. And, a lot of other films kind of end on that freeze frame of the one moment. This was one of the pioneers of that technique. And it's very interesting. And there's been a lot of speculation about what it means specifically in this film.
Yeah. I feel like the film doesn't have a super duper clear message. It just kind of conveys an experience, and this anecdotal story about a boy who's struggling to fit into society, and you get a lot of entertainment out of watching it, but you also get a lot of kind of this deeper resonance throughout, where you identify in parts and you feel bad for him in parts, and then in other parts you think he's just doing it to himself, and then you question why you think he's doing it to himself versus at times versus at other times why you're rooting for him. And it's an interesting thought experiment to watch this film. And a lot of the French New Wave directors really got into putting their own life philosophies and their own outlooks and their own ideas within the film. And when you go back to thinking about this film as semi-autobiographical, it's kind of it's you can kind of look at it as like an origin story of Truffaut's life philosophy, whatever you want to say that is, because it's about Truffaut kind of coming of age, or a Truffaut-like character coming to age.
Yeah, and along the lines of that kind of thematic thread, I was seeing a lot of, influence that this film probably had on Wes Anderson, especially tonally and thematically. Wes Anderson has a lot more lightheartedness in his films, but there's still a lot of the same kind of ideas of troubled family relationships, young person and older person dynamics, of the troubled older person and how that affects fairly clean slated younger person, either for good or for bad. And we already know that there is pretty much a direct relation between this movie and Rushmore, because there's that shot of the chain link fence in Rushmore, like the famous jail cell scene in the 400 Blows. So as long as we're probably going to be talking about influences that we see coming out of these films for each of them, Wes Anderson was the one that I kept thinking of over and over again while watching the 400 Blows.
Yeah, I've seen that shot before from 400 Blows, but I didn't realize it was a jail cell. I just thought it was like a chain link fence. But knowing it's a jail cell, the photo has so much more significance than a chain link fence.
Right. Yeah,
And,
I did. I actually did too. I was kind of surprised at how small the jail cell was, because usually you see imitations of the shot where the fence kind of fills in the whole frame, but it was actually kind of smaller in the frame.
Yeah, it was like a personal jail cell.
Yeah, that ended up with 5 people in it at some point.
Yeah. So he got moved to an even smaller cell. But anyway, enough of cell spoilers. Let's move on to the next film today. Breathless, 1960, the very bold, very brash first film of Jean-Luc Godard.
Yeah, this film was so influential on American film, and it pulled so much from American film that it's hard almost to talk about it on its own. But at its core, Breathless is about a guy who kind of has this, definitely has this Humphrey Bogart-ish idea of himself, where he wants to be cool, and like in the Rat Pack, he's got a fedora and the kind of knockoff suit on. And he, like, the first thing we see of him is he steals a car and he drives off, gets chased by police, shoots one of the police, and then he goes and finds his girlfriend and ends up hanging out with his girlfriend for the whole movie. And then she finds out what happened and kind of gets roped into this escape the police kind of thing, while also having an existential crisis. And it's almost more about the style than the substance with this movie. And it is a very stylistic movie. It's so evocative in the way that it's presented, that it really captured the imagination of a lot of audiences.
Right. Because the story is kind of your standard crime thriller, especially if you're looking.
Think of In Cold Blood.
Yeah, and it's got that 1940s, 1950s Hollywood Rat Pack vibe going to it, like you're talking about. And he keeps imitating Humphrey Bogart. He keeps doing that thing where he rubs his thumb over his top and then his bottom lip. Apparently, that is a Humphrey Bogart signature, which I didn't realize, and I'm a huge Humphrey Bogart fan. And
I didn't realize that either, and then I was thinking
now
about it, and I was like, oh, he does do that in Casablanca, doesn't he?
Yeah, but, see, the reason it's a signature is because it just feels like part of Humphrey Bogart's character. But for this guy, the character within the film, not the actor did a fantastic job. But for the guy within the film, he's pretending to be a Bogart-style character, to be this gangster type, but he's not really. or at least he's failing to live up to that.
Right. He realizes that ideal he has in his head is not so idyllic in practice.
Right. And he kind of has this devil may care, don't give a crap, do whatever I want, fast-paced attitude, and the film mirrors that perfectly. It just goes from this to that to this to that. I had a hard time at times keeping up with the subtitles. You could say trying to read them all left me breathless. But yeah, it's got all this innovative style, but it might seem a little confusing and disorienting if you've never seen something like that before. But considering how influential it's been on cinema moving forward in time, to all the cinema you and I have grown up with that's contemporary to us, going back and watching it, it's not too hard to follow, but it is interesting to see how bold the style was, because it's bolder than almost anything you see these days. I feel like maybe the techniques have been worked out and absorbed, and the rough edges have been smoothed off and sanded off, and now they work better into what you consider the look of a film. But going back to the 1960s and the French New Wave, it's a bit jarring at first, but once you get into it, it feels cool. It feels fresh.
Yeah, so just to get into specifics, one of the things that kind of started in the French New Wave, or at least became more popular in the French New Wave, is, first of all, cutting extraneous pieces of the story out. So instead of, watching someone walk through a whole scene to get somewhere, you just kind of cut to where they are. And then, like, at this point, film had been established as an art medium, and people could start to associate, two shots with each other more easily, and we don't have to be kind of told the in-between steps. And then even farther than that, jump cuts. Godard is famous for jump cuts, which is basically if you have one long shot of, say, driving in a car, and we're looking at our female protagonist having a conversation, we're cutting, we're still in the same shot, so the frame is pretty similar, but we're cutting out pieces of time in the middle of the shot, so it looks jumpy. And this is, like, I'm trying to explain it very technically, but everyone is familiar with this at this point. If you've ever seen a vlog, yeah, you know what a jump cut is, because it's any time that, a phrase has to be cut. It's basically the film form of an ellipse in literature.
Right. And vloggers,
Godard pioneered this, like, majorly.
Right. And vloggers have kind of found ways to make it work where it doesn't feel super jarring. And like you said, like, vlogs are very ubiquitous, so we feel very used to it. But to go back to 1960 and look at all these jump cuts, it's pretty shocking, especially if you're a fan of cinema du papa.
Right. And as long as we're on the jump cut thing and the way that conversations are cut using jump cuts, every time that started happening, all I could think of was Upstream Color, because that is exactly how Shane Carruth cuts almost the entirety of Upstream Color with the conversations, L cuts and J cuts with dialogue, spliced in between these different cuts that just imply what's happening rather than showing us every stage of a conversation or a movement or anything.
And this film also kind of introduces us to, I want to call it Ferris Bueller style fourth wall breaking. And it doesn't happen often, but our main character does turn to the camera and directly address us.
Yeah, in the same kind of snarky way that Ferris Bueller does. It was actually kind of jarring to me to see that in this old film, how the main character, as he's driving along, turns to the camera and it's just like, yeah, so I love the country. I love the mountains. And if you don't like the mountains, then you can take a hike. I was just like, oh, okay. Wow. It's almost exactly the same kind of vibe of the beginning of Ferris Bueller. And Ferris Bueller doesn't do it all the time either. But we definitely see the roots here in this movie.
Right, right. And that's just another example of how widespread the influence of the French New Wave has been, especially among pop culture movies, edgy movies, poppy movies, bold movies, because that's what these were. These were the leading edge of pop culture at the time, and those kind of styles have always found a home on the leading edge of pop culture moving forward, especially within the cinema.
Yeah, and we're not saying that like the French New Wave necessarily invented these conventions. Like the fourth wall breaking had been invented in theater and stuff well before this, but popularizing it in a film medium, in a narrative storytelling, just kind of, throwing it in there as an aside and not really referencing it, that is something that hadn't necessarily been done. If you're in a movie, you are trying as hard as you can to make the audience forget that you're in a movie. Not so with these movies.
Oh yeah, the French New Wave is all about movies that were very conscious that they were movies and that were okay with reminding the audience that they were movies. Mostly because they were made by people who were obsessed with movies. They were cinephiles. They loved the stuff, and they wanted to pay tribute to the things they loved, and they wanted to be bold, edgy young Turks about it.
Yeah, another thing that Godard does in this film that kind of, tells us that we're watching a movie is sometimes we'll move out of a scene with our main character where the police officers that are kind of bumbling around trying to find him but not really finding him till the end are maybe in the background of a shot, and we do an iris wipe that closes in on them like think of a Bugs Bunny cartoon where the black circle closes around Bugs Bunny right before the end. And he does that on the police officers. And it's just like, this is the movie here. Don't forget that there are two police officers that are looking for him. Look, they're right here. It's just kind of an interesting technique.
Yeah, it's kind of an extension of the grand parody of crime thrillers that Breathless is. And it's also another example of kind of like that selective framing that French New Wave directors like to do, and especially Godard loved to do, where he would point out just this part of the frame, whether it be with an iris wipe or with a reframing or like a square wipe or something. And he does a lot of iris wipes in Breathless.
Yeah. And actually, I just remembered the other fourth wall break is the only time that our female protagonist breaks the fourth wall, which is actually the very last shot, which I won't explain the context with, but basically, after everything has climaxed, she looks right at the camera and is like, hey, remember this is a movie? And so that's kind of the last thing that we're left with in the movie.
Yeah, yeah. I also want to pose a question before we move on to Cleo from 5 to 7, because it's the only one not with this type of ending. But what's with French films and running? I want to throw that out there. I don't know the answer to it. I don't know if there is an answer to it. Just food for thought. What is it with French New Wave films and running? There's so much of it in there.
Right. Both like the 400 really blows and Breathless end with long running shots. They're very poignant.
Yeah, and I went and I watched movies outside of the 3 we had selected for this week because, shocker, we have time to watch movies that are outside of what we selected for that week. Sometimes, not all the time.
Sometimes.
But especially like with the French New Wave, which we were really excited about. I was really excited to watch some more films. But I watched Jules and Jim by Truffaut, and it's got a lot of running in it too. And then I watched The Weekend and that by Godard, and it has some running in it too. And I was like, wow, what is it with these people and running?
Yeah, and I sent you a clip because I had watched Yvonne's Childhood by Tarkovsky, and this is post French New Wave, so it's definitely an influence, but it has a very similar, almost to the 400 blows running shot, and the context makes that shot extremely poignant as well. But we can even see that even that small motif of running off into the distance or running in some way to finish the movie kind of trickles out of the French New Wave. But with that, let's move into our final film, which is Cleo from 5 to 7, crossing over to the left bank. Alex, tell us what Cleo from 5 to 7 is about.
Right. So Cleo from 5 to 7 is about a woman who literally cannot run away from her problems. She so the title of the film is talking about this time period that the main character Cleo, short for Cleopatra, although not her real name, it was assigned to her by like a publicist or an agent or something like that. She's a singer, and her name is changed to Cleo Patra, long form of Cleo, which she goes by.
From Florence. From Florence. Which is important later.
So the time period in the title, from 5 to 7, is a reference to the time period she has to wait on the test results of a biopsy she had from her stomach that might or might not be cancer, although you do find out in the end, one way or the other. I won't tell you which, but it's almost it feels like a reflection on the fleeting nature of existence and what you can do with that time, even if you know it's limited, just in a super condensed manner. And there's a lot of symbolism surrounding that, and Cleo's like, I don't want to say adventure. It's almost like her trying to endure 2 hours of waiting, and what can she do with that time, and how is she going to spend it? But it does have this literary feel and more direct themes that play to these big questions, like this existential question about what do you do with limited time, and also being surrounded by all these images and symbols reminding her of that time, like babies and old people, and motherhood. Is she ever going to be a mother? Does she want to be a mother? And it has it has a more literary vibe. And that's kind of what the left bank was known for, was being a little more literary with their work than the right bank, which was very stylized with their work.
Yeah, and it's also slightly more experimental. The way that the film opens is Cleo goes to a mystic reading tarot cards, and basically anytime we're looking at a shot of the tarot cards, it's in color, and then when it
like
cuts
top down
to
shot of the tarot cards,
right, cutaways,
like think like Wes Anderson close-ups of things on tables,
right, which, I mean, this is clearly where stuff like that is coming from, and we'll talk about the titles in a second. But and then when it cuts back up to either Cleo or the tarot card reader, it's in black and white. And that was even jarring for me. Like, I was not expecting that at all. And then the whole rest of the movie after that one scene is in black and white. So we're clearly into the French New Wave, maybe crested the midpoint of it at this point. And so some of the conventions have been established, and even the conventions of the French New Wave are being broken and played with at this point.
So yeah, it opens with some really interesting titles, and it keeps having really interesting titles throughout the film as these chapters or these time periods pop up. Some with more fancy titles, some not. As we chronicle the time and keep us updated, it's literally a ticking clock.
Often it'll tell us, who she's interacting with at that point, because it's kind of a series of interactions with people in her life. And so the title will come up with the name of whoever she's going to be interacting with for the next 10 minutes or whatever.
Yeah, but it's clearly a style choice. It does add a lot to the themes of the film. It helps, like you said, with the ticking clock, and just the temporariness of this time period that Cleo has, until the big reveal of whether or not she has cancer at the end. But it's also very stylistic, and it's not a way that titles were used in the past in cinema to papa. I mean, we're used to it these days. Think of Quentin Tarantino, think of Wes Anderson, and lots of other film directors who feel like they're imitating those two, but those two were imitating the French New Wave, and other films of the sort that would do these chapter titles, and would do similar stylized or significant or added meaning titles, or titles that add meaning to the film over the course of it.
Right. And another thing about just kind of the whole conception of the film is pretty innovative because, I mean, the time period is between 5 and 7, and the movie is, I believe, an hour and 40 minutes, which makes the film almost a minute-for-minute account of what Cleo is doing. And that is a pretty interesting, way to approach a story, and one that had kind of been experimented with before. I believe Alfred Hitchcock's Rope had come out before this and stuff like that. But this is still a pretty unconventional way to tell a story.
Right. And Alfred Hitchcock was a huge influence on the French New Wave. So I wouldn't be surprised if that had something to do with it.
And then the last thing to mention specifically about the style is the fact that it uses a similar jump cutting technique that Godard uses, where as soon as Cleo comes from the tarot card reader, it kind of jump cuts 3 or 4 times while she's walking down a hallway or something, just to kind of disorient us and kind of put us in the same frame of mind. And then similar things as she's walking and traveling around, the cutting is a little jarring and montagey and stuff like that. So that is the influence that has come from the genre that she's working in. And then all those other things we were talking about are kind of things that she brought to the table at this point.
And it's worth pointing out that Agnes Varda is one of the most significant female directors up to this point in history. And certainly the most significant within the French New Wave. I can't think of another off the top of my head, but there might be one. And she's the second female director to appear on our podcast so far. I wish we had done a better job with that. But she is a really great director, and she brings that unique female perspective in the 1960s to this film. Since Cleo is a creative person, she is a singer, living in a man's world, dealing with a lot of the big influences on her life over the course of the film we see are men, both positive and negative. Most of them are negative up until about 30 minutes left in the movie, but you do see that more unique perspective, or at least different perspective, in the 1960s of being a female creative, both as the main character and as the director.
Yeah, and it's one of the, I mean, it's not just the fact that it's, a movie by a woman about a woman, but that's actually one of the themes in the film. One of the running themes is this idea that Cleo wants to be looked at, wants to be admired and seen, and yet pretty much everyone she encounters who has a occupation similar to that, her best friend is a portrait model who is looked at all day and sculpted and recreated, and she thinks that kind of looking is grotesque, and that kind of exposure is too, exposing or vulnerable for her tastes. And she meets several people on the street who, one guy does the trick where he eats a frog and then, regurgitates it alive, and another guy who has put a nail through his bicep, and these kind of freak show kind of things. And she just thinks that they're all horrendous, but they all revolve around being looked at and being, seen as something interesting. And that's kind of what she wants, but she has this kind of disconnect within herself. And then we also see this female cab driver that they're riding with, and they have this whole conversation about, women in professions that are typically men's professions. And even in the car ride, in that taxi car ride, she turns on the radio at some point, and there's a news item about Edith Piaf, who I believe, I don't think that this is coincidental, because Edith Piaf is one of France's most famous female singers, who actually started from a very poor place in life, busking on the street and stuff like that, to kind of rags to riches story, as in contrast to Cleo's affluence and she has this very big, nice apartment. She has nice things. She buys new hats just for the whim of it. And I mean, her name is Cleopatra. So if that doesn't tell you something about her station in life and personality, it's just all of these things kind of flow into the themes of this movie.
Yeah, her name Cleopatra was not picked on accident. It was definitely picked very meaningful. Everything about this film feels very meaningful thematically, which is where the left bank gets that reputation of being very literary.
Even the Unshin Andalou poster.
Yeah, the Unshin Andalou poster that they snuck into the background. And of course, I caught and sent a screenshot to you because that's just how we roll on the Filmlings.
Yeah, it was great. But like I said, that's almost kind of a physical proof that there is influence from the surrealists and especially from the left bank who are more experimental. And Unshin Andalou specifically, but other surrealist works were clearly some kind of an influence on these movies.
So without trying to spoil the ending, we should mention that it ends on a much more upbeat note than, say, Breathless or any Italian neorealistic film for that matter. It kind of ends almost positive. Not really, but definitely. Well, the point is she has a better outlook than she did before. The character feels better at the end than they did at the beginning, compared to the 400 Blows, where it's kind of the same that from the beginning to the end, and Breathless, where just watch Breathless.
It goes downhill, yeah.
It goes downhill.
Yeah, and Cleo from 5 to 7 is definitely more about Cleo's arc throughout the film than, necessarily what the outcome of the tests were. That's basically the MacGuffin of this movie, to get Cleo to a place where she could be happy with herself regardless of what the outcome of the tests are. Because at the beginning is a very daunting prospect. As I've been talking about, she wants to look beautiful and be seen and be admired. And, even if it's non-terminal cancer, that kind of change that chemotherapy and stuff brings over a person is not something that she would want. And I actually think that it's ironic that Cleo wears a wig and she takes it off about halfway through the movie. And yet this idea of going through chemotherapy and possibly having to wear a wig is kind of the most traumatizing thing that could happen in her life. She's just this huge ball of contradictions that we're following and watching her try to work that out throughout the film.
Yeah, I didn't even realize she was wearing a wig. It spooked me.
Yeah.
But it does have some significance with the chemotherapy thing, like you were talking about. And you're right. The A plot is that motivation factor, that MacGuffin, that the test results that are sending her on this emotional arc, the B plot, to discover how to be okay with herself and be okay with life and have a more positive outlook about things. Right.
So, Alex, do you think that we can, just from these 3 films that we've picked, which might not be enough of a sample size, but what do we think about the difference between the right and the left bank?
Well, okay, so obviously you need to watch a lot more movies than we have to declare this definitively. But I feel like what we've been researching, what we've been seeing, kind of holds true, that the right bank was a lot more about style and attitude, and the left bank was a lot more about the themes just paired with the style and the attitude, and maybe getting even into the weirder places, like you're talking about with the experimentalism and the mix of color and black and white at the start of Cleo from 5 to 7 that you see.
Right. And we haven't watched enough to know if the fact that Cleo from 5 to 7 actually has a fairly positive ending, if that difference in outlook is a result of the left bank, or maybe it's just getting farther away from Italian neorealism and that kind of pessimistic pall doesn't necessarily hang on things as much as it did with all these movies that are being very heavily influenced from the French New Wave, being so close to it.
Right. It's an interesting question, and it will take a lot of watching of films, a lot of watching of French New Wave films to determine that. But that doesn't seem like a daunting task. It seems like an interesting task. And if I didn't have to watch so many movies in the next week, I would watch a lot of French New Wave films. And I'd try to answer that for you guys. So maybe you guys would have to do that. Go watch a bunch of French New Wave films. And free plug of the week, so many can be found on Filmstruck. Go check out Filmstruck. It's got so many films that we're going to be talking about over the next 9 weeks, 8 weeks combined with this week and the last week. And a lot of Italian neorealistic films, a lot of French New Wave films. And you can answer that question for yourself.
Right. So we're not sponsored by Filmstruck, but we're just throwing that out there that they're a streaming service similar to Netflix that hosts a lot of old movies, a lot of basically what you'd consider cinephile or movie buff movies. And they're actually the only place I could find online to legally stream Cleo from 5 to 7. So if you want to watch that movie, check out Filmstruck. You can get 14-day free trial.
So with that, let's talk about overall notes. And Jonathan, do you want to tell us a little bit about the influences from American cinema into the French New Wave before we talk about what the French New Wave put back into American cinema?
Right. So basically, after World War II in 1946, a basically ban that had been in France on foreign cinema was lifted. And so this flood of American movies and directors came into France, and they were able to see directors like Alfred Hitchcock and John Ford and Orson Welles, and all these people who've had this huge body of masterpiece works that had very specific styles to them. And so they developed what is known as the auteur theory. As we kind of mentioned at the beginning, with camera stylo, as in the idea that the camera is like a pen, as like an artist or a writer who has complete control over the work that is written or drawn. The same should be with a director who should basically, it's a team of people working on a movie, but the director is the one who is communicating through all these people, essentially. And so that's where we see all of these directors that we looked at today have very specific techniques that they applied in each of their films. And then that carries on into today. Many of the directors that we've talked about, Christopher Nolan and Wes Anderson and Shane Carruth even have very specific fingerprints on their films that all fall into the auteur theory.
Right. And it was kind of a new way of looking at film because beforehand, in the earlier Hollywood studio system, film was just really viewed as entertainment. It wasn't necessarily viewed as art in the same way that you would think of literature or theater or something like that. It was just kind of seen as entertainment, and the directors were just people doing their jobs. But after auteur theory, or during auteur theory especially, and this is the interesting part, that this was applied in retrospect back onto people like Alfred Hitchcock, who was still alive at the time and still making films at the time, but his golden era was mostly over by the mid-1960s. And then were considered, after they'd done all their work, to be artists, to be people who had done great art through the films they had made. And that's an idea that carried forward, like you were talking about, and that's how we still think of directors today. And that's one of the reasons why young people interested in film are so excited to be directors, is because they're the artists of cinema. But it's also interesting to think that back when Alfred Hitchcock was making films in the 40s and 50s, nobody, or somebody was, but it wasn't widely believed that he was a great artist. It was just believed that he was a great director.
Yeah, and he definitely had kind of a brand about him, which you can see in the fact of, his advertisements and stuff where he would come out and introduce the birds and kind of have a sit-down talk with the audience and tell them what Psycho was going to be about. And, of course, his Alfred Hitchcock Presents show, where literally the symbol for that show is his silhouette and all of his cameos. And yet still, it was never kind of penned as this complete theory of a lot of directors who each one individually has their own perspective.
Camera
they're
studio.
still acting right. They're still acting as kind of an agent of the studio that they were working for at the time.
Yeah. So this was kind of the first group of directors, the French New Wave, who helped propagate this idea of auteur theory and then lived into it and really went into it and developed their own styles with this conscious thought that this is my style, this is how I do things, this is my artistic signature. And so with such stylized films like you see with Truffaut, Godard, and Varda, and all the rest that we talked about in the earliest part of the podcast, you see them be so stylized. And I think part of that is trying to live into that thought of the auteur theory, and this is how you're supposed to be as a director, and you really need to leave your mark on every film. And whether or not that piece, a little bit of armchair psychology, is true or not, it definitely holds true that they left very stylistic films, and if anything, they only got more stylistic the more films they made.
Yeah, it's definitely this idea of, since they are kind of this counter movement to the big studio-produced films in France at the time, similar to the Surrealists that we talked about in the Buñuel episode, it's this idea of what can we do that's different enough to get noticed? What can we do to be seen as a separate entity within the film world and have people actually take notice and say, hey, that's different, and yet still achieve the same thing. So we're still telling scenes, we're still telling stories, we're just finding ways where techniques have been used and used and used and used and used, and like, okay, maybe there's a different way that we can get the same point across, and just make it a little bit more interesting or a little different, or just at least give people the idea that there are other ways that we can think about telling a scene, shooting a scene, editing a scene, than the ways that we have always done it.
Yeah, and it's also interesting to look at their work because, much like early Italian Neorealism, this was also very scrappy filmmaking. They weren't working from super big budgets. I mean, they had effectively made enemies of the very large producers and studios in France during their time at Cahiers du Cinéma. Because they ragged on them all the time. I mean, Truffaut got banned from Cannes before he won an award there. So they weren't working from the highest of budgets, and their insistence of shooting on location meant that they weren't filming under the best of conditions. And a lot of it could be attributed to art through adversity, but I don't think as much as is sometimes made out to be attributed to that should be. But it definitely is a factor. All the camera movements, all the shakiness, some of that is the fact that they can't lay down track in the middle of a street in Paris.
Right.
You have to deal with a shaky camera, or the fact that the audio is sometimes out of sync, and sometimes it's on purpose, and sometimes you feel like maybe it's not.
Yeah, this is at the very fringes of handheld filmmaking, because up to this point we are still having very encumbered cameras. They have a lot of things that have to be attached to them. Camera gear is heavy, and the audio gear that goes with it has to be attached by a bunch of wires and stuff like that. And at the mid 50s through the 60s and 70s is when we really get lighter cameras and stuff. And in the 60s and 70s, we definitely start seeing more cinema verite, documentary filmmaking, because people could suddenly, one person could carry a camera and a microphone and walk around and do things. And we are just at the precipice of that. So we're seeing a lot more free-flowing, not as pristine camera moves, but more creative camera moves in some of the things that the French New Wave auteurs were creating.
Right. And you see all these styles, all these techniques and choices that they made and made really popular influence other directors as we move forward. Like we kept mentioning, and especially when we mentioned like Wes Anderson. I feel like Wes Anderson is just the perfect example of that. And I don't know whether that's because I've spent so much time being obsessed with his work or it's because he just is. Like he has drawn, he's drawn a lot of influence from a lot of places, but he's drawn a lot more influence from the French New Wave than maybe anywhere else. Also from Hitchcock, but the French New Wave also drew from Hitchcock. So you see a lot of those super stylistic choices in a Wes Anderson film. And a lot of the directors nowadays who we think of when we think of signature styles like Quentin Tarantino, they grabbed stuff from the French New Wave. And, there was an interview of Tarantino talking about how he outgrew the French New Wave. And I'm kind of like, okay, whatever, Tarantino. You also say you're going to retire, but we'll see if that happens. But there's no doubt that it's a big influence. Also because the 60s and the 70s is kind of the boom of the film school. The idea of the film school, the propagation of the film school, that's when the film brat generation, George Lucas, Spielberg, were in college. So the French New Wave was popular around the same time. It's not a hard leap to see that how the French New Wave came to be a staple of film school curriculum.
Right. And so kind of going forward with that, we get the American New Wave, which follows right on the heels of the French New Wave. And someday we'll get to an American New Wave podcast, but there's probably way too much content to cover in one. But things that we can see specifically from the films that we watched this week are things like this very dark and pessimistic, again, kind of look at life, and some of these fascinations with different ways of telling stories. So you've got movies like Easy Rider, which has very experimental editing and depressing themes and ending, and Bonnie and Clyde, and you've got even going later on into the 2000s, like we were talking about Shane Carruth, and even Christopher Nolan's Following, we can see stuff like these films coming from this very dark crime thriller in black and white, and all of this kind of stuff. And even filmmakers like Akira Kurosawa, who was, an auteur in his own right from a different part of the world, cites The 400 Blows as one of his favorite films. And so even though he was kind of at the peak of his career, at the same time that all of this was going on, that cross-cultural influence was still happening. So that's just to tie as many things that we've already talked about on the podcast together as we can. And I think we're even going to see a couple more influences of the French New Wave whenever we get to Russia on the world tour with the idea of montage. But that's not what's coming up. Alex, tell us what we're going into next week.
That's right, Jonathan. Next week, we're going to India, where we can connect more things to more things on the Filmlinks podcast. India has not one, not two, not three, but like a bajillion film markets, and they're all super prolific, and they've been around for a very long time, and we're going to take a look at some of those films. The Indian film, what I'm going to call the supermarket, all the markets combined, all their different languages put together in one big market that takes place across India and Pakistan, probably makes more films than any other film market on the planet, including Hollywood. So
bigger audience and everything.
Oh yeah, it's a very big film market that does not get a lot of attention from American cinephiles, or at least American cinephile podcasts like us. I'm sure there's plenty of cinephiles who are invested in Bollywood and Tollywood and Collywood and all the other woods. But we're going to be taking a look at only 3 films because that's how many we can fit into a week next week. With 1960s Mughal-e-Azam, 2008, My Name is Khan, with King Kong himself in it. Shah Rukh Khan, one of the biggest film stars in the world that you've probably never heard of.
There's our clickbait.
And then there's our clickbait. And then last but not least, Bahubali, The Beginning from 2015. And then we will go ahead and recommend that you watch the next Bahubali as well, which came out this year. But we only have time for one in the podcast. Yes. What happened to the middle, Jonathan? What happened to Bahubali, the middle?
There's only two. Apparently, the Indian film market does not feel the need, like Americans, to get as many movies out of an epic franchise as possible. But if you want any small reason to go see Bahubali, watch the trailer. It is incredibly intense. And the trailer is why we put it on this week, because it just looks so epic and awesome that we could not pass it up.
If you're looking for super epic, super entertaining films where you gotta have to read the subtitles, then we've got the week for you.
India does not do anything halfway.
No. I mean, most of their films are recorded in 2 languages at one time, and that's crazy. But that's about all the time we have in France for now.
If you have movie suggestions for us or just want to reach out, I can be found on Twitter at @JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Garinger.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at thefilmlings.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people will know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next week.
All right, I will see you in India. Can you hear the people sing?
Oh my gosh.
That's appropriate.